Welcome back, listeners, to Mosaic's Community Life Podcast in Canada, Episode 9. My name is Jane Teasdale, one of the co-owners of Mosaic Home Care Services and Community Resource Centres. Today, I will be interviewing two guests from Epilepsy Toronto. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Elana Ellison, who is Certified Child Life Specialist and the Coordinator of Children and Youth Services at Epilepsy Toronto. In her role, Elana works with children, youth, and families to enhance coping with epilepsy through education, counseling, and group programming. She regularly facilitates school workshops to promote understanding of epilepsy and encourages inclusion in the classroom. Elana holds a master's degree in early childhood studies from Ryerson and completed postgraduate training in child life through McMaster University. Welcome, Elana, and we're happy to have you on the line today.
Thanks for having us.
Our next guest is Noura, who is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Lead at Epilepsy Toronto. She works closely with the different teams at Epilepsy Toronto to continue to ensure that all of their programs and services are equitable and represent the needs of Epilepsy Toronto's diverse clientele. Her role involves establishing partnerships with communities of diversity to expand outreach to people living with epilepsy. She holds a master's degree in epidemiology from Western University. In the past, she has worked in patient education at the University Health Network hospitals and as a researcher in the Department of Global Health at the University of Toronto, focusing on women's health in countries in conflict. Welcome, Noura, and lovely to have you both on with us today.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Oh, you're welcome. So my first question, I have a number of questions to put forth to you ladies today. And the first one, I think, Elana, maybe if you answer this one, what is epilepsy, and can you explain this to our listeners?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a pretty obvious place to start. So we think of epilepsy as a brain-based condition. And what that means is that epilepsy originates in the brain. So if we think of our brain as the computer or the control center for our body, we know that our brain controls the body by sending signals to give commands to different parts of the body. And what can happen sometimes is that those signals can be interrupted or misfire, and that causes seizures. So really, epilepsy is a neurological condition that presents with recurrent seizures. And these seizures, which are caused by sudden bursts of electrical activity in the brain, can vary. So people can experience varying types of seizures, or seizures can also vary in terms of their strength or frequency. And this may depend on where in the brain abnormal activity is found. But I think what's really important to understand, even more so than sort of what's going on in the brain when someone is experiencing a seizure, is to understand and recognize that epilepsy is more than just seizures. And when we look at the definition of epilepsy that's presented by the International League Against Epilepsy, which is a research consortium, they define epilepsy not just as a brain condition that's characterized by seizures, but also characterized by neurobiological, cognitive, psychological, and social consequences of this condition. And so what that means is that epilepsy impacts the individual in terms of their cognition, their memory, and there can be emotional and social consequences of living with this condition. And we'll talk more today about really that's where the work that we do at Epilepsy Toronto comes in to support the person holistically and their family around coping with epilepsy. Okay. I guess I also wanted to make mention that epilepsy can develop for someone at any time throughout the lifespan. It affects both males and females and people of all races, ethnicities, and backgrounds. And while most people develop epilepsy in either childhood, so under the age of 10 years, or in older adulthood, so after the age of 75, it can develop for someone at any time across their lifespan.
Okay. And Noura, do you have anything to say, I guess, as the seizures get worse with age? Within Mosaic home care, we have a lot of clients, obviously, that are older persons. And within our resource centers, we also have a number of people coming in. So definitely, this information about as you age, are you more prone to getting seizures? Maybe you can elaborate on this a little bit, Noura.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in terms of do seizures get worse with age, there's actually no clear connection between seizure severity itself and age. However, the prevalence of epilepsy does increase with age. So people over the age of 75 account for almost a quarter of cases of new onset epilepsy. However, an important thing to note here is that the causes of epilepsy are also different across age groups. So in older adults, we see most commonly that the cause of epilepsy is something like a stroke, whereas in young adults, the most common cause of epilepsy is a brain injury or head trauma. And from the children that we see at Epilepsy Toronto, we see that those children who develop epilepsy are generally thought to have a genetic predisposition for it because the cause is unknown. But in reality, we really just don't know the cause. And so we assume that there must be a genetic predisposition for it. At Epilepsy Toronto, we've seen members who have developed epilepsy and might have felt like it was a little bit out of the blue. And so as Elana talked, we look at epilepsy not just as the brain condition, but as how can it impact a person's life and what can we do to support them through that journey of discovering what their life is going to look like after diagnosis.
Okay, thank you, Noura. And I have a question for Elana. And can you describe the different types of seizures for our listeners and what they may experience when having a seizure?
For sure. And I think that this is a common misconception in epilepsy, in the sense that when people think of a seizure, they often think of a convulsive seizure, a seizure where someone may fall to the ground and their muscles may get tense and shake, when in reality, there are many different types of seizures. So we're going to speak to what those different seizure types are. But one thing I wanted to mention is that over the years, there's been different terminology that's used to describe seizures. And the current classification that we use was only put forth as of 2017. So it's a fairly new classification system. And some people may be familiar with older terms, so things such as grand mal seizures or partial seizures. And those are terms that have become somewhat out of use. So when we talk about classifying seizures, we categorize these into two main categories. So we have what are called focal seizures and generalized seizures. So focal seizures are seizures that originate in a localized part of the brain. And we might further categorize focal seizures into whether the person maintains a level of awareness during the episode. So you can have a focal seizure with retained awareness and a focal seizure with impaired awareness. And then I also mentioned we have another category of seizures, which are known as generalized seizures. So these are seizures that quickly involve networks throughout the whole brain, so impacting brain activity in both hemispheres. And there are specific types of generalized seizures within this classification. So ones that people may have heard of before are absence seizures, tonic-clonic seizures, or atonic seizures, to name a few.
Mm-hmm. And I can talk a little bit more about those.
Yes, Noura, that's great. I know you had some notes that you'd sent me on that. So yes, you can elaborate on that as well. Thank you.
So just to talk about a few specific examples of, let's start with focal seizure. So a focal aware seizure, which is also known as an aura. A person who's experiencing a focal aware seizure is usually fully conscious, so it does not impair awareness of their surroundings, and they will usually remember that experience. And it's experienced through visual abnormalities or order abnormalities and hearing distortions, or it could be, so it's either a sensory experience or it could be an experiential symptom. So it would be a sudden sense of fear or hallucinations. And sometimes these auras also occur as a warning or a signal for the individual that a bigger or a convulsive seizure is about to happen. So while auras can be really scary or cause some anxiety for people who have them, they also can be very helpful because it gives the individual the time to, get comfortable, sit down, ask for help because they know that a seizure is coming as that seizure moves from a focal seizure to a generalized seizure.
Okay.
And then another example of a focal seizure is a focal dyscognitive seizure. And in this seizure, you will have some impaired awareness, usually, and that will affect consciousness and memory. It will also mean that someone who's having a focal dyscognitive seizure might be unresponsive to questions if you're trying to call them or get their attention. This kind of seizure will involve repetitive movements, which include humming, lip smacking, or fidgeting with your hands. A person who's having a focal dyscognitive seizure might get up and start wandering around, but would not reply if you try to call them or get their attention. And they most likely will not remember that they did any of that once the seizure is over. And then I do also have a few examples of generalized seizures. Some of the ones that Elana mentioned, like an absence seizure, is actually a non-convulsive seizure, and it involves a blank stare. So a person will just be staring blankly ahead and will not be responsive to anyone calling them, and will most likely also not remember those few seconds where they were staring into space. And that's why it's usually actually mistaken for daydreaming in a person. So it might not be recognized as a seizure at first. And then Elana also mentioned tonic-clonic seizures, which are, I think, the ones that people are most that people recognize the most, because this is the seizure that has two phases. The first is the tonic phase, which involves stiffening of the muscles and loss of consciousness, and that's where the person typically falls to the ground. This phase is then followed by the clonic phase, where the muscles will jerk and twitch in rhythmic convulsive movements. And that will happen typically throughout the whole body. So I think that's what people usually think of when they think of seizures. And then the last one Elana mentioned earlier is the atonic seizure. And this is where a person will suddenly go limp and lose consciousness. These types of seizures usually cause people to suddenly drop to the ground. So they're also called drop attacks. Some of our clients who have atonic seizures or drop attack seizures wear helmets to protect their head from injury when they fall, because you can be banging your head on anything or the ground, and that could cause some trauma to the head as well. So we usually recommend that they wear helmets.
Wow, this is all very helpful information, a lot of things that I didn't know, and especially for our listeners, to understand if they do see people in the community as well, and just understanding what may happen. Mm-hmm. And Elana, maybe you can describe what happens after a seizure. So what would an individual go through, I guess, with their body or tiredness or whatever the case may be?
Yeah. So typically after a seizure, there's a period of recovery that's also known as the postictal period. Some people recover immediately after a seizure, particularly one that might have been very short, whereas others may take minutes to hours to feel like their usual self. In particular, if someone is having a big convulsive seizure that's involving a lot of contraction of muscles or convulsions, then we would expect that they would have some muscle fatigue or soreness after that episode. Some of the common symptoms that we might see in someone in the postictal period include things like fatigue, confusion or disorientation, memory loss, difficulty talking. The person may have a strong emotional response, so they may feel very sad or upset or anxious, or experience some embarrassment if other people have witnessed the episode. Headache or nausea are also common symptoms as well. There can be weakness in one side of the body or both. Or the person may be slow to respond or not able to respond right away. And so for a lot of our families who are witnessing these episodes, it can be quite frightening afterwards. And so we teach families what to expect both during a seizure and afterwards, and how they can support the person and provide that reassurance and keep them safe following the seizure, and to have an expectation that it's not unusual if the person is a bit confused or tired afterwards.
Thank you, Elana. And I know Noura had explained some of the safety accommodations prior for people living with epilepsy across their lifespans, and there are some myths. I mean, do hear sometimes that, putting something like a spoon in someone's mouth while they are having a seizure, that can be quite dangerous. So I think Noura is going to give us some information and with regards to also home-related things that you can do at home as well to help you.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you mentioned that specific myth with the spoon in the mouth, because that's actually the one we get most often when we're out in the community doing our educational sessions on epilepsy. We always have someone saying, well, shouldn't you put a spoon in someone's mouth when they're having a seizure? And to that we say, please don't. It's really dangerous to put a spoon in someone's mouth while they're having a seizure. It could harm their mouth, jaw, and teeth. So we're often reminding people that if you witness someone having a seizure, please don't put anything in their mouths. In fact, don't try not to block their airways. And if there is anything that is blocking their airways, like they're wearing a scarf or their jacket's tight, make sure you remove that if they're having a seizure to give them, the space to breathe while they're moving or while they're having their seizure and convulsing. Another thing that we usually talk about is we also recommend that when someone is having a seizure, that you never restrain them or hold them down, because that's another instinct that we have. We're afraid that they're going to move around and bump into things or hurt themselves. So instead of holding someone down, make sure to remove anything that could hurt them from their surroundings, and never actually try to restrain the person who's having the seizure, because trying to hold someone down could cause injuries. Their muscles are all contracted while they're having the seizure, and they're going to be fighting you while you're trying to hold them down, which would cause an injury like a dislocated shoulder, or just muscle injuries from the muscle tension. So, clear the surroundings, let the person go through their seizure, be there to support them, but don't try to hold them down or put anything in their mouth.
Okay.
Yeah, those are some great strategies that Noura shared around, how people can support someone to maintain their safety during a seizure. And we also work with clients around providing or suggesting accommodations for their own personal safety. So within the home, there might be some considerations. For instance, we encourage clients to take a shower instead of a bath. Having a bathroom door that opens outwards, or things like using a closed coffee mug for hot beverages might be some things that we suggest depending on the frequency or the severity of a person's seizure. And then in the community, things like having a medical alert bracelet can be helpful in case of emergency. And we also have some clients who have a seizure response dog that can help to notify others in the event of a seizure.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, dogs they're amazing to have around, especially for people with disabilities. So that's interesting to hear.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for that. And how is epilepsy diagnosed, and what happens next? Noura, maybe you can start with this question.
Yeah, so there's actually no one single diagnostic test for epilepsy. So it's not like a blood test and there's a marker in your blood that says you have epilepsy or anything like that. Diagnosis is mostly based on a few different things. And these could include an investigation of the first seizure. So what did the first seizure look like? So it really helps if someone had witnessed that first seizure, that they, take notes or keep in mind what they witnessed, how long it took, what did it look like, because that will also help with the diagnosis. Another thing that's done is a physical examination and a look at the family history. And then all of these things together combined with supportive tests like EEGs and MRIs, just to take a look at the brain and the brain activity that's happening during those seizures, is really how epilepsy is diagnosed. However, if someone has 2 or more unprovoked seizures, so they're not because of something to do with blood sugar levels or drug or alcohol withdrawals. So if they're unprovoked seizures, then that person will most likely be diagnosed with epilepsy, because we don't always know the exact cause of this epilepsy. And so all of these things together is usually what results in an epilepsy diagnosis. And then once someone is diagnosed with epilepsy, they're typically prescribed anti-epilepsy drugs. And really the goal of that medication is to reduce or completely prevent the occurrence of seizures. And we found that around 70% of individuals diagnosed with epilepsy will have what we call seizure freedom with medication. So they still have epilepsy, but they don't have any seizures because the medication is controlling the seizures. And so the medication is not really to cure the epilepsy, it's really just to help with controlling the seizure occurrence.
So, Noura, with the medications, I guess obviously the doctor is overseeing this. Are medications changed regularly with, I guess, the amount of seizures that they have, or are they changing usually medications around or checking on this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Some of the medications that our clients are on, they'll need to have their blood levels checked frequently to see how the medication is being metabolized or to make sure it's not impacting certain enzymes within their metabolism. And we also know for some of our clients that the first medication they try may not be effective. And so if that is the case, then they will go on to try other medications to try and control their seizures. So we usually say that epilepsy is refractory or drug resistant if an individual has tried 2 or more epilepsy medications and they continue to experience seizures.
And thank you, Elana, for explaining that. And I think you were also going to talk about the different, looking at different diets or seizure management. Maybe you can explain about some of that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So most often in terms of epilepsy management, the neurologist will start with recommending a medication or a second medication. And if those options aren't found to be effective, then there are other alternative forms of treatment. So one option may include things like the ketogenic diet. So that's a medically prescribed and very carefully monitored diet. It's a high-fat, low-carb diet that helps to control seizures in some people with epilepsy. Epilepsy surgery or medical cannabis or other treatments that also might be considered for individuals with drug-resistant epilepsy.
Okay. And I think you were going to go over what are some of the common conditions that often occur with epilepsy and how do they impact the individual?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In my experience working with individuals within our epilepsy community, mood disorders and difficulties with attention and memory are common things that we see both in young people and adults who are living with epilepsy. I work very closely with young children, and behavior challenges is also very common. And sometimes the emotional, the learning, and behavioral consequences of epilepsy can be really difficult to tease apart. So we might ask, are these the effects of seizures? Are these caused by side effects of medication? Or are these difficulties maybe related to some underlying structural or chemical abnormality in the brain that might be responsible for both seizures and these other symptoms that we might see? And really, for many of our clients, these co-occurring conditions often present greater challenges than seizures themselves. So, for example, someone might develop anxiety in relation to the uncertainty that they experience with not knowing when they're going to have seizures. And then that anxiety can lead to behavior changes, right? We might see someone withdrawing from others, or they might have a lot of emotional distress because they're frequently worrying about having another seizure. So we really work to support clients through counseling and support groups to help reduce the sense of isolation that they may be experiencing, and also provide them with support and coping strategies to manage these different aspects of the condition.
Okay. And also, I think you had quoted just in your information with connections between epilepsy and other neurological disorders such as dementia and Alzheimer's. Maybe if you can highlight that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there have been some studies that found connections between dementia, Alzheimer's, and epilepsy. And really, ultimately, it comes down to that any changes in the structure of the brain can cause seizures. And so this happens for people who've had a stroke or a head injury or a brain infection, like we talked about earlier, but also it can be seen with those who have dementia. So as there are changes in the structure of the brain, that could also bring about the onset of epilepsy and seizures for some older adults. And we did look into epilepsy and Parkinson's, and there is a connection in the literature with epilepsy making Parkinson's condition worsening if they are coexisting in a person, but there isn't anything about them that shows that if someone has Parkinson's disease, they're more likely to have epilepsy. There's not much more about that interaction that's understood in the literature right now, but
Do you think
something?
do you think that's going to be worked on maybe in research in the
I think
coming
so.
years? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. It makes sense that there could be a connection there, but it's not one that's been identified yet.
Okay. Well, thank you. And then we've talked about a lot of information, a lot of helpful tips for our listeners. And Noura, maybe you can just highlight some of the resources which might be helpful for families to know about, either for younger children or older adults. And then how would Epilepsy Toronto help with this? So Noura, you can go first, and then Elana. Thank you.
Sounds good. Yeah, so Epilepsy Toronto provides many resources and supports for those living with epilepsy and their families. So, our adult services department supports adult living with epilepsy through one on one counseling. They provide advocacy and help with navigating the healthcare system. And one of the main things that our members have difficulty with is a feeling of isolation and loneliness after diagnosis. They're not really sure where to go from there, what their life is going to look like after they get that first diagnosis. And maybe they haven't really experienced it or seen it in someone else, and so they don't know what it's going to look like. So we provide many specialized support groups that are available for adults living with epilepsy. We've got support groups for moms and partners of those living with epilepsy, and also for professionals who are living with epilepsy. We also provide support groups for those opting in for surgery to ensure that we're creating a space where our members feel safe, sharing their experiences and learning from one another, because surgery is another one of those that's obviously a scary thing that can cause anxiety and worry for our clients. And so we want to make sure that, they know that they're not alone in this, and that there are other people who have experienced this and been through it, and what that journey might have looked like, so that they feel safer in their decision to maybe opt in for surgery. We also have social clubs and Friday recreation groups, which have all moved online since COVID.
Yes.
But we made sure to continue to run those because the pandemic is already isolating us, and with our clients who already have a condition that also makes them feel isolated, we wanted to make sure that they don't feel that loneliness and that isolation during the pandemic.
Yes.
We also have an employment services department at Epilepsy Toronto, and it provides workshops and support for professionals living with epilepsy through professional development, job coaching, and work placement. We also like to have a focus on education, and so our employment services department also educates clients on disclosure in the workplace and companies on accommodations for those living with epilepsy.
Wow, you have a well-rounded organization. And are the programs free for individuals online and in person? Is that free?
Yes, all of our services are free.
And I mean, I think, organizations, Mosaic runs a lot of social programs. We did do that in person prior to COVID. But I think organizations are probably looking at more of a hybrid model, because maybe there's people that don't want to come out and be with other people, or they feel safer at home. So definitely those online Zoom platforms of, discussions and education is great for people who don't want to come out face to face. And Elana, I think you were going to talk about the children and youth services.
Yeah, I would be happy to. And, hearing Noura describe the different programs and services that we provide for adults, I think it's clear there's such a robust level of services that we offer. And the case is the same for young people within our organization. So I'm a child life specialist, and I work as a coordinator within our children and youth services. So we run support groups, and we also provide one-on-one counseling for the person with epilepsy and their whole support network. So we work with parents, caregivers, siblings, and children who are living with epilepsy. So one-on-one counseling sessions, for instance, might help kids deal with things like difficult emotions or anxiety through providing coping strategies or providing opportunities for emotional expression. And another important component of our work is building community amongst people with shared experiences. And we know how powerful that is for our members. And so we do this through a range of peer support programs. So we have support programs for parents, young adults, and even siblings of children with epilepsy. And then we promote awareness of epilepsy in the community through school workshops and also social media outreach. And that's something that's been a bit newer for us since the start of the pandemic, when we were looking for ways to engage our community when we weren't able to be present together in person. So, for example, we have a web series called Live with Lily that streams on Instagram and TikTok, and we have our episodes up on YouTube. And this is an educational social media web series. It's produced by us at Epilepsy Toronto in partnership with a wonderful organization called Teaching Awareness Through Puppetry. And then we offer different programs and events throughout the year, things like family picnics. I'm currently running a group for a parenting workshop for parents who are supporting children with difficult behaviors. And we also have run groups in the past on topics like the transition to adulthood for youth with epilepsy.
Thank you, Elana. And I think this sort of leads into some of the information that Noura will be talking about is the educational sessions for individuals to include family caregivers, which is important because they're part of that family healthcare team. So I guess, Noura, if you could, describe this a little bit in detail.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, education is such an important component of self-management in epilepsy, which is why it's such a huge focus for us at Epilepsy Toronto. Often families come to us after a new diagnosis and they feel overwhelmed by the new information and all the choices they have to make around medication and other aspects of epilepsy management. So we provide individualized and some group workshops to promote understanding of epilepsy and epilepsy treatment. We also provide epilepsy education to community organizations around Toronto. And those include different cultural and religious communities with the aim of eliminating some of the stigma and misconceptions that are associated with epilepsy. Also important is teaching epilepsy first aid to the client's support network, which would include, their siblings, their parents, their caregivers. And seizure first aid really means how to respond in the event of a seizure. So because there's so many different seizure types, which we've mentioned only a few earlier, we really need to individualize this information and also talk about how to monitor seizures and when to call 911 or seek emergency attention. Because you don't always need to call 911. You often actually don't need to call 911 when someone has a seizure, unless it's a first seizure or there are other complications. So making sure that we talk to the new families and talk to the community to make sure that if someone does witness a seizure, they know what to do. So we also help members create individualized seizure response plans to ensure that their seizure information is organized and available when they need it, so that if they have a seizure in the community and they don't have someone around them from their support network or their care group, then whoever does witness it knows how to, react to it.
Now, this is great information. And yes, care navigation, in individuals' care. I mean, we see it with families who don't know where to start. They don't know the information. They haven't been in that, area of health, perhaps. Maybe it's a new disease that has happened or medical situation. So they're really needing the supports of community agencies, to sort of connect the dots and help families. So thank you for that. And Elana, I think if you could go through, in many instances, families, friends, and community may react in certain ways to individuals diagnosed with epilepsy. And does Epilepsy Toronto provide campaigns on social media or information sessions to the community and employers on how to be helpful and empathic to those with epilepsy? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Our See the Person campaign focuses on bringing forward the stories of the individuals in our community who are impacted by epilepsy. So if you go on our website, epilepsytoronto.org, or on our YouTube page, we have some beautiful profiles of our members who have so kindly shared their personal stories to promote awareness and really emphasize this idea of see the person behind the condition. We also provide workshops in schools, community settings, and to employers to promote inclusion, to clarify misconceptions, and also to destigmatize epilepsy. So often when I'm speaking in schools, I'm talking with kids about the importance of treating a student or a classmate who has epilepsy like any other kid in their class. And young kids are often really reassured to hear that epilepsy is not contagious, and they feel empowered to learn the steps of seizure first aid so that they can feel less helpless in an emergency situation.
Thank you for that. You within your roles, both of you have a heavy load of work, but doing tremendous work in the community. And Noura, if you can, I think you had some points as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that we do also do presentations for Epilepsy 101 and Seizure First Aid in community organizations. And that's really because we aim to deal with some of the myths and misconceptions surrounding epilepsy and how to deal with seizures. Like one of the most common things we've heard from participants in our educational sessions is that people living with epilepsy are sometimes viewed as being possessed or looked upon with fear in some different cultures from around the world. Sometimes epilepsy is believed to be a spiritual condition instead of a medical one. And that is one of the most harmful misconceptions when it comes to epilepsy, since not only does it isolate the individual living with epilepsy from society, but it also prevents them from seeking medical help if it's not looked upon as a medical condition. So that's one of the main goals of our educational sessions in the community.
Thank you for that. And we're coming to the end of our program. So could I ask both of you any takeaway messages for our listeners today?
Well, one thing that I did want to mention is we've spoken a lot to the programs and services that we offer at Epilepsy Toronto. And of course, the individuals that we provide services to generally live within the city of Toronto. But if there's anyone listening who lives in Ontario, but outside of the Toronto area, you can visit Epilepsy Toronto to learn more about the services in your community for those who are living with epilepsy. So the website for that is epilepsyontario.org. And I would encourage everyone to look into the agencies that are within their own local community that can provide assistance and resources. And there's a list of all of those different agencies on the Epilepsy Ontario website.
Thank you. And Noura, do you have any takeaway messages for our listeners?
Yes. I'd say one of the hardest things about living with epilepsy is that society and the communities we live in don't have a solid understanding of the condition, and instead attach a lot of stigma to epilepsy and seizures. And sometimes really the best support for a person living with epilepsy is honestly every person that they interact with on a daily basis, knowing that they are, understood and seen, and that their condition is not something that they need to hide or, run away from. So educate yourself, I think.
Yes. I mean, both of you provided some wonderful information and, very helpful, I think, for our listeners. And we will certainly try and get this out. And I'd like to thank Elana and Noura for agreeing to be on our Mosaic's Life in Canada podcast today, and also to the production person putting this together for Mosaic. And stay tuned for our upcoming podcasts in April, where I will feature Karen Shin, CEO of Downsizing Diva, who will speak on decluttering and organizing your home for the spring and summer and new beginnings past, hopefully, COVID. So thank you again for listening, and bye for now.